Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the first session of a live NHSDC in 2 years. This is very weird to be standing in front of a room full of people again, so bear with us as we fumble over our words and you get to see all the weird habits we've developed over the last 2 years. My name is Brian Roccapriori. I use he, him pronouns. I'm with the Cloudburst Group. Co-presenting with me today is Mary. I'll let you introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Mary Schwartz. I'm with Apt Associates, and happy to be here.
So you are here in the data privacy session. So as a prerequisite, I'm assuming everybody watched HMIS Governance 101. And just to kind of set the groundwork here, this is going to be an office hour style presentation. So Mary and I have, I'm going to say 20 to 30 minutes worth of stuff that we're going to talk at you about, but this is going to require a lot of participation here. So we went through the introductions. We're going to switch things up. This is a standard kind of HUD session that gets repeated from time to time. But we are going to take a different track today about how we're going to do this. So we're going to review, and if you sat in the first 4 rows, you got a copy of a stock privacy response. If you sat in the back, you're probably antisocial, and you don't get one of those because I only printed 60 copies and there were so many chairs in the room. So we're going to go over that, and then we're going to go over some provisions and responsibilities of the HMIS privacy notice. And throughout, we're going to take questions, and at the end, it's going to be kind of like a live AAQ session, so you can just throw all your hard questions at us right in real time. Next one. Learning objectives. We are going to identify strategies for managing data in HMIS environment, making sure that we're being responsible to the folks whose data we are collecting, because it is their data. We're going to make sure we're being responsible to the federal partners so you can get all your reports done. Understanding the uses and disclosures of data, and specifically personally identifying information, or PII. And then we're going to go over some community examples and have some Q&A. So here is the life cycle of a question that you have a question about data sharing. You do exactly what we just told you to do and go to the AAQ and you submit your question. And then you get a HUD-approved answer, which I will speak for myself. People have called them non-answers. It happens, right? So there's only so much that we can say about that kind of stuff because a lot of it is really locally based and locally driven. So people don't like those answers, so they open them again, and then they get the same answer right back again. So we're going to walk through all that today and really get to the bottom of what it is we're talking about. So you can go to the next one, which is a screenshot of what it is you're going to get when you answer those questions, or when you ask those questions. And there's a good chance that Mary or I are the ones that hit the send button on that, because in the background, the two of us are also on the HMIS AAQ desk. We do all sorts of stuff. So you can expect to get that same language back again and again and again. And we can go to the next one. There's a lot of stuff up on this slide. And Mary's going to get into more of this when she starts talking. I'm not done yet. So I'm not going to read this slide to you, but there's a lot of confusion about what you can share, what you can't share. COVID and vaccine stuff, you may have noticed, has kicked up a lot of HIPAA stuff. So just to say on this slide what it says is if you collect health information in your HMIS and you're not a HIPAA covered entity already, you don't kind of magically become one just because you started collecting it. If you ask a question about surviving domestic violence, you're not automatically covered by VAWA. If you start asking questions about substance abuse, you're not covered by 42 CFR Part 2. CFR is Code of Federal Regulations. All right, go me. So what it really boils down to is the type of organization you are, depending on what covers you and how you can and can't share data. Just because you do collect information on health, and we all do because it's part of the HMIS data standards, doesn't make you a HIPAA-covered entity to begin with. And we saw a lot of that with COVID and vaccine stuff, sharing with public health information entities and how people can and can't share data. Next one, we're going to talk about amending our privacy notice. On the next slide, please. There we go. So you can amend your privacy notice if to include the uses and disclosures. How you can and can't use data depends on what is in your privacy notice. Now, that's not to say that you can't go back and update your privacy notice, because that is in the 2004 HMIS Data and Technical Standards. You should all have this in your system because it was in the 2004 HMIS data and technical standards, which are now 17 years old. So you've had 17 years to get these into your privacy standards. Everyone should have this in their privacy standards at this point. But there's a process for these things, and that's all locally governed. So you have to go through whatever policy it is in your region, whether that's the HMIS governing committee or the COC board, and all of those changes need to be documented and kept on file with your HMIS lead. But how you can and can't share data is all locally governed. And there's a lot more on local stuff, and how uses and disclosures are put together is what Mary is going to talk about right now. Now, we're going to not share microphones because we're going to be safe and avoid each other.
Okay, so if you haven't noticed, we're following that piece of paper pretty closely and walking through each of the parts of that stock AAQ answer that you'll get when you ask us privacy questions. But what we, like Brian said, want to do is make sure that you understand that stock language. It's really not a non-answer. It gives you the answer, but a lot of the times the answer is, what do you have written down already? So it's a very, what do you have written? What do you have to follow locally that determines what you can and can't do with your data? So data uses and disclosures, this is, I would say, the most important piece of that stock answer in there. There are things that HUD requires you to disclose and have listed on your privacy notice. There are things HUD allows you to list on your privacy notice in terms of uses and disclosures of data. And then you can locally come up with some other stuff too, right? As long as you write it down, you and you're communicating clearly with the clients that come through your door what the uses and disclosures of their data are, then you can follow those guidelines for what's okay and not okay in terms of using your HMIS data. So what does HUD require? I think we're on the next slide now. So you have authority as a, have you guys heard the term CHO? Covered Homeless Organization. That is the term used in the 2004 notice. We don't really say it that much anymore, but as a recipient of HUD funding, you are a covered homeless organization. So however you're operating in your governance structure as the recipient of funding, driving your use of HMIS, right? There's a couple different avenues through which the money might flow that is getting to you as the HMIS lead and your organization running HMIS. But what you need to know is that you don't need to obtain consent. This is the thing that got a little tricky recently. HUD went back through and reviewed what we have been saying on the AAQ desk to folks for years, and there was a little bit of confusion over whether written consent is required, right, of a client's. We've used the term ROI, release of information locally. Let me ask real fast, how many of you still have a written ROI policy in place in your continuum? Don't be shy and don't be scared to admit it, it's okay. But one thing that became really clear when we went back through the 2004 notice in the last couple of years, and why we're focused so clearly on this piece of the guidance, is that ROIs, written ROIs, are not a requirement of HUD's. So HUD does not require you to get written permission from a client to collect their data, nor to use it and disclose it in the ways that HUD has said you both are required to and you may want to. So as long as they're written down in your privacy notice and the client understands what those uses and disclosures are, and they have an opportunity to get in writing from you how your COC is going to use their data and disclose their data, if it's written down, that's consent. That's in, we're not going to use the term inferred consent, but that's kind of the old school way of thinking about it. You told them in writing, this is what you're going to do. They don't need to sign an ROI for that to be done. Does anyone have any questions or concerns? I want to stop right there. Yes.
So along the lines of what we were just discussing, I think the conflict is like going to be eternal with the release of information conversation. We continue to try to find language to wrap my own head around it, I took the long track to the data world through direct service. So I'm definitely like, I'll die on a stack of releases of information. I still struggle to wrap my head around it, particularly when most of our partners are social workers who are bound to their code of ethics, which is all about self-determination and confidentiality and things like that. So when we're trying to push the message that that's not necessary in this case, like I continue to have a hard time, like not only buying in myself, but also convincing
Sure.
300 social workers.
Sure.
So maybe more guidance or help on that.
Yeah, so I'm thinking of stuff I heard at the Institute yesterday around equity and ways to increase equity in your communities, and like the nitty-gritty administrative, like you can have this piece of data but not this piece of data, or you can share this but not that. I'm just kind of thinking like one of my reasons for favoring an amended privacy notice and a clear listing of uses and disclosures for people. So that's not to say keep it hidden and don't tell them that what you're doing. Be really clear about what you're doing, but that by listing it and being clear about it, it doesn't require them to sign, but they can read that and walk away. And the more administrative, what I've seen, one of the biggest benefits of kind of flipping to this type of data collection and uses and disclosures in a privacy notice rather than an ROI is administratively, it is far easier to manage, and that will remove some of those kind of, I guess, restrictive and sometimes inequitable ways that we've implemented our services for folks. I think that's my biggest reason for advocating for it, is that data is out there and data collection is happening everywhere. If we can be really clear about that data and how it's going to be used and disclosed, and now move to the real meat of providing services and ending homelessness, that feels to me like a more equitable way to deliver services than, hey, see this form, fill out this form. You have to fill out this form first before you can have this thing. I don't know. That's one of my reasons.
And
lots of people. Alyssa, you want a microphone? Can you come and grab a microphone to say what you're going to say? I should have
While
my
she's
mask
grabbing
on.
the microphone, the ability to disclose information isn't unlimited. Just because someone is informed of their consent that it's going into HMIS and it's going to be used for these things, there are still rules and regulations around how that data is used, how that data is disclosed. So I can't just open it up and tweet out, Mary Shorts can enter an emergency shelter. Like, that's not a thing that I can do. So the protections are still there for the client data. And with the informed consent of having all of that information available to them, it's still all there. It's just not a piece of paper with someone signing it. Alyssa.
Yeah, I would just echo what you just said, that no ROI does not mean not informed, right? And in a lot of communities where they have made that shift, we've actually seen that case managers can explain the privacy policy better because they're not reading, to your point, a 6-page ROI. They're reading a page that clearly shows these are the uses and disclosures and the way in which we can share your information. So in a lot of situations, people didn't know what the ROI even said. But with an updated privacy policy, it doesn't mean it's not informed. It means that it's explained at intake. And to Mary's point, they can walk away, but they don't have to sign something.
Managing the releases of information is a total disaster, and I hate it. So I hear you. I understand the service provision part of it. I think I'm just on the long track. I'm trying really hard to have an open mind about not requiring consent. I understand informed consent, but thank you.
We'll do our best to win you over.
Hi, Rachel Cook, also from Nashville. So something that we've run into with that is okay, let me start over. So our agency became the HMIS lead in 2018. So yes, 17 years, all that. We're kind of starting from scratch, spent the past couple years getting policies and procedures, release of information, all of that better than the old one. So kind of starting with our HMIS Oversight Committee and our governance board to get them on board with even data sharing for the first time only a year ago, right, in our community. And that kind of blew people's minds. So to think about this, we're moving in that direction. But I think the cultural shifts take time, right? So the culture in our community is, well, what if, this person specifically doesn't want someone at X agency to know that they are being served by Y agency. They shouldn't have to be able to see their stuff in the system. So it's gotten very specific into they need to be able to say exactly what will or will not be shared, or if they don't want to be in the system at all, et cetera, which we don't have a 6-page ROI, but it is a very detailed 1-page ROI. So we're kind of just thinking about how to continually improve that, but also without changing it again. It took a second to roll out this new release of information with data sharing. So thinking about making changes again and getting the community on board with that, to be a little strategic with that too.
Daunting in a time where we fully understand that everybody is really busy doing a lot of different things right now. We're all in the midst of a pandemic still. EHVs are out there. There's a competition, I guess, that's happening that is taking up a lot of people's time. So when you come to a CO...
What are you talking about?
That's what I heard. But like when you go to a COC committee and you're just like, hey, everyone, I know you have these other 30 different things you're focusing on, but now I want to talk about this release of information, which is like the 10th thing that the COC chair will ever think about. It's rough getting that kind of buy-in, but like plugging away and making sure that those kinds of things are addressed, because ultimately it leads to a better service system for the folks we're serving.
So I want to be really clear about what those are. So now we're about halfway down the page under updated guidance regarding data disclosures not requiring client consent. So this non-answer has some pretty specific answers for you as far as what should be written in your policy. Just remind me to put on my mask if I start walking around, but it's so hard to talk with that mask on. And you guys need to hear me. All right. So HUD requires 2 mandatory disclosures regarding the inclusion that you have to have in your privacy notice. 2 mandatory disclosures: client access to their information and disclosures for oversight of compliance with HMIS privacy and security standards. These are the non-negotiables. Have them written down. Take this sheet of paper back to your COC and look side by side at your privacy notice and make sure it says it in there somewhere that those are required disclosures. HUD also allows you to write down that you will use data to coordinate and provide services for functions related to payment, for administrative functions, and for creating de-identified data sets from the PII. You can also, if you want to, write down uses like avert serious threat to health or safety, uses and disclosures about victims of abuse, neglect, or domestic violence, research purposes, law enforcement purposes. These are up to you and your COC to determine if those are uses and disclosures that you want to include in your privacy notice or not. So that's the real meat of the administrative burden, right? Is to set up a system of information for your clients so they know the things you're required to do with their data and the things that you may do with their data. And that's the real answer in the privacy notice answer that you get from the AAQ. If you write it down, that's what you need to administer and follow. If you write down that written consent is required, then that's what you have to do. But that's not required by HUD. Consent and uses and disclosures and being really clear about uses and disclosures is what is required. I hope that clears up a little bit of I guess I want you not to walk away with the sense that the clients don't own their data and that they don't have any say in anything. They do. They need to be well informed. And we think, and have said a couple times now, that this path of information for the clients is probably a lot clearer than that 1, 2, or 6 page ROI that they're currently probably not reading, right? But if your case managers are trained in walking through, like, your data's gonna go in here, okay? And we're gonna do this with it, and here it is written down for you to see, and we just want you to know that your data is being used and disclosed in these ways. That's informed, I think. Brian.
Absolutely. We had a follow-up question over here.
Okay.
Hello, Gaither again. Sorry. So, if I'm not mistaken, the ROI was in a draft. So it was something that was going to be considered. Is that correct? That, I mean, isn't that where it started? Where like COC started inputting ROIs into the system because they thought that HUD was going to start using.
I mean, maybe. Who knows the history?
Well, okay. Well, the reason I wanted to ask was if that was something that was a road that was looking to be gone down. Were there reasons why they didn't go down that way? Why it didn't become finalized? And could those reasons or research or anything be shared with COCs to help them inform their community?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that this is the trying to be helpful ways to inform you guys about how you can walk this kind of new guidance forward. And if we need to add some more around like reasons behind it, we can take a look at that and draft something, whatever new words we say on the AAQ desk, HUD has to review. So we'll think about some, but I think, a couple slides ago, it was like, where are we drawing all this from? It's the 2004 data standards. This isn't anything that hasn't been said for 17 years. It's just being really clear about it. Now that final HMIS, the HMIS proposed rule, I think is what you're maybe referring to, something that was like in draft form and then never came to fruition. I think partly because just the times they are a-changing and things moved on, and reviewing the 2004 and putting the guidance in this clear way really it at least clarified the privacy notice part of 2004. So I think I've said all that now. Okay, this is possibly a real life situation, you guys.
Hypothetically.
This is hypothetically real. Privacy notice for COC includes all allowable uses and disclosures from the AAQ. So I'm at the place where at a case study, like I've gone back, I've reviewed this thoroughly, I've matched my privacy notice, it's been implemented, whatever. We're in this world. And then the local public health authority wants a list of all shelter residents from HMIS to cross-reference with internal testing results. So the local health authority has a bunch of positive and negative COVID tests, and they want your database of emergency shelter clients to check against that list so that they can see who may or may not have coronavirus in your shelter. Can the COC provide the public health authority with all shelter data given the uses and disclosures that are described here? Yes or no? Who wants to take a stab?
Show of hands for yes. Show of hands for no.
The no's take it. So the disclosure is listing out the disclosures that you may provide, and I think the one that this is referencing is in the third section, uses and disclosures to avert a serious threat or to health or safety. But additional guidance that you can find related to this on the HUD Exchange adds in the fact we had kind of a legal review of this exact situation. And it boils down to providing an entire list of shelter clients to a health authority for this purpose is not allowable. The request for disclosure has to be specific and one time only, and there's a few other provisions. I wish I would have included a slide on it, but I will send the link or get the link out to you guys. There's a document on the HUD Exchange where it's like, yes, I have said uses and disclosures to avert a serious threat to health or safety is a possible disclosure, but that does not mean that somebody can just do a broad sweep of data in my shelter. That's not allowable per the 2004 standard. So You need to think about these scenarios as you write your privacy notice, and think about, this is where the heavy administration comes in, right? What am I going to do with different requests that come my way, and what are the administrative possibilities within the software that I use, and what are the administrative allowances that I have listed that allow me to do this or that. And you would err on the side of more protective of your clients, right, and their data than broad releases and disclosures of whole swaths for no good reason.
Yeah, and this is where it's weird not having a chat box to drop a link into.
It is, man.
So I've gotten very used to just providing real-time information, but that's not the case right
I think
now.
we're way better at that than this. But
I've got them all queued up beforehand. But part of what that document, Mary, I think we're talking about the same document here. There's data sharing during a public health threat, and we updated it to include natural disasters too. So you can talk about during a hurricane, a tornado, a fire, or whatever disaster of the day is, what the data sharing looks like in those kinds of situations. And did I answer your question with that one right there? All right.
Yep. Okay. Moving on to method, and we've already really covered this, so I'm just going to go over it real fast. You list in your privacy notice what the method of consent is, and that's the rule you follow. So whatever you have written down is what you have to follow. What you guys have, some of you have shared, is that you have an ROI as a requirement. The method you're going to obtain consent, you have to follow that, but you can amend your privacy notice and move away from that restriction because it's not required by HUD. Oh, cool. One more case study. Oh, and I gave you the answer too, maybe. Okay, unauthorized disclosure. The HMIS lead just included a screenshot with this never happens either, does it? We don't get AAQs with client PII in them. You guys don't do that. When they submitted an HMIS AAQ regarding coordinated entry and EHV referrals, Shelter A was accidentally given direct access to modify Shelter B data with administrative controls on the back end. Reporting from each shelter includes data from both, however, no reports have been submitted yet. So what these two scenarios lead to is unauthorized disclosure has happened, and now one of the things that I learned early on in my HMIS lead career was think about the damages, right? Who's getting damaged by those unauthorized disclosures? They're the folks that need to be told what happened and be allowed, some remedies. So which of these requires client notification, A or B or both? Raise your hand if you think A requires client notification. Raise your hand if you think B requires client notification. Raise your hand if you think both require client notification. Okay, they both require client notification. B has a little bit less of a damage done, but A definitely requires client notification. What is the remedy for each situation to ensure the least amount of damage to persons, organizations, and systems? So if you decide there's a disclosure required, to the notification required, what would be the way to do that? Talk through the scenario. Let's just stay on number one, letter A, sorry. A, you submitted the client PII to the HUD Exchange in an AAQ. What do you do next? Brian and I would look at that and notify you and let you know that you've made a big mistake. And we would ask you to look at the privacy notice and what requirements you have for disclosure and notification to the client in that instance. So if an HMIS lead or a system admin accidentally discloses client PII, there needs to be some sort of remedy, notification, breach of data. Imagine, we've all probably gotten a notice from Target or somebody, right? Your data was included in a big breach. That's a notification that your data was not shared according to the rules that Target or MasterCard or whoever told you about when you gave them your data. So it's the same kind of thing. Has anybody had to do that? Actually, has anybody had to notify a client that their data was accidentally released without their permission or against the uses and disclosures described? Nobody? Okay. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Rachel Gibson and I work for the Planning Council. And my question would be, So if we did that, yes, but wouldn't we notify the agency that the client is coming from first, and then we would discuss from there about notifying the client itself? Because a lot of the times lead agencies don't directly talk to direct clients. So if you were a lead agency and this somehow happened, wouldn't you talk to the agency that the client came from first before you would have to discuss? Usually they would want to discuss it with the client and not the lead agency person who accidentally did it, correct?
Right. So let's say you're the HMIS lead and Brian's data was breached, and all of a sudden you're on the phone with Brian, a person who has zero relationship with Brian, who I'm not going to take your phone call. I have no idea who you are. So using the project which has that relationship with Brian for that notification, absolutely.
So it's why the green one down here is starred, is so that you guys can take this information back and think about what you would do in different scenarios in cases where you have to disclose that you have unauthorized disclosure, right, has occurred about data, and in what scenarios, and whether, it just goes back to what is authorized, what have I said I would do, and then what accidentally got done, and how do I let someone know that it happened? So if your process is to go from, your agency, lead agency, to the shelter first, but from my perspective, if I saw a client PII on the AAQ, I would notify you. You and your COC lead would get notification. HUD would get notification that occurred. And then there would need to be a follow through. My responsibility would be to follow through and make sure you disclose to the client. However you do that on your end is up to COC policies, remedies, etc. But this slide is here to have you start thinking about it, especially for folks like in Tennessee. You want to have these kinds of answers for people, because as you move from a written ROI consent structure to a more informed privacy notice structure, the question is going to be, well, what happens if? So if you can think through the what happens if scenarios, that helps you advocate for the uses and disclosures that are going to be meaningful for your COC.
Yeah, and equally as important is a grievance policy for folks who feel like their data has been misused in a way. So they have an avenue to properly go through channels to understand what happened, if it was the right thing, and what the remedy is for that situation. So making sure that there's a grievance policy in place in your privacy notice.
So this is part of our stock answer too, so I'm still just walking through the pieces of this standard answer. If you need more assistance, you would contact the TA portal through the HUD exchange. The authority to make these changes that we're talking about and all this stuff that we've discussed today, the authority lies with the COCs. That's what the COC program interim rule. So thinking back to where are the avenues of funding that are coming into my COC, the HUD funding, and wherever, it comes down to your being required to use HMIS, you kind of follow the money to determine who can has the authority to make these kinds of changes. So you should have a COC board, you should have a structure through which you would walk back through any changes to the policy.
And if we're bringing it back to our standard answer, please remember that the COC interim rule gives the COC authorization over its HMIS is included in all of our language.
Yeah.
So that is definitely part of our standard answer as well.
Yep. Next slide, please.
So you may have noticed there's an increased focus on victim service providers and comparable databases in the last year or so. And this comes after a long silence from HUD on the use of comparable databases. Just wanted to note here that there is another session tomorrow at 11:15. If you want to hang out with me again, we're going to talk all about comparable databases and why there is a new revised focus on them. But victim service providers are prohibited from entering into HMIS because of VAWA. And there's a lot of resources out there for victim service providers now. There's a new comparable database manual, there's a vendor checklist, there's the decision tree to figure out if you actually have to use a comparable database or not. And on the bottom there, which all of these slides are or soon will be in the app, there's a community example about how a community incorporated their victim service providers into their coordinated entry for housing prioritization. I think it's great because it highlights my old community of Connecticut and the system I built, but I'm a little biased there. But it does give a good example about how you can incorporate your victim service providers confidentially into your prioritization scheme. The next slide is a couple resources, and I know we can't click on them now because we are in a live setting, but really encouraging folks to get in an AAQ because you may have a very specific situation that doesn't get addressed in the stock answer that we might be able to provide some guidance on. If you need more in-depth assistance, and this is in that stock answer as well, if more assistance is needed, you can formally request TA to be assigned to you, and there'll be a TA provider that'll work with you if it gets approved to work through whatever issues it is you have. And HUD does not have authority over VAWA. For VAWA related issues, that goes through Safe Housing Partnerships, and they provide the TA on that. And on the next slide, I believe we are up to questions.
Hello, Rachel from Nashville. For informed consent, we also have a public privacy notice in addition to our written release of information that is to be posted publicly in intake areas and for outreach workers to carry, et cetera. Would you recommend that that be something that is handed to every client if there's not a release of information to like go over it with them there rather than just having it posted like an administrative document on the wall? Is that kind of the best standard practice?
Mm-hmm.
The requirement is posted on your website so that they can go find it. So if you want to make sure they know your website, that's the requirement in 2004. You could also have it printed out. So like as you make the transition to a more informed consent world, you can go above and beyond, right? And make sure they have as much access to these uses and disclosures as you want them to have.
And you don't want it to be a barrier because not everybody has ready access to the internet to go look up your privacy notice. So having it on hand if it's requested is great for the folks that want it.
Yeah, hi. So I had a comparable database question. So I've seen some COCs interpret the no participation requirement as is just limiting the PII. So they're entering clients in more or less anonymously. Which in my mind would not be correct and could potentially, well, even aside from the questionable nature of that, there's also the reporting considerations too, because in order to be a comparable database, it has to be able to generate reports and beyond just privacy considerations. So is my understanding correct, or is, because that's something I've wanted to get confirmed.
Yeah, victim service provider should not be touching HMIS anonymously or otherwise. That's the short answer. We have a whole other stock answer about victim service providers and comparable databases that we could fill an entire workshop with. But if there is a specific question, because there's a lot of like what makes a victim service provider, and that is how it gets defined in Hearth, and that is the funding that those agencies receive. So if a program receives VOCA funding, FIPSA funding, OVC, OVW, they are a victim service provider, and therefore they should not be touching HMIS in any way whatsoever, and they should use a comparable database. But there's other situations, like COC DV bonus program, that goes to a mainstream provider who's not a victim service provider, then they could enter that information into HMIS. So that's where, on the previous slide, there was the link to the decision tree of like who can and can't enter into HMIS, and that should guide those decisions. And it's really like a black or white issue. There's no like you can kind of participate in HMIS. That doesn't exist. It's A or it's B.
We have a stock answer for whether anonymous data should go into HMIS. We'll make that our next session. We'll just break down the stock answer of anonymous data. Sound
It'll
good?
be a series of stock answer workshops.
Stock answers with Brian and Mary. Oh.
Thanks. So I'm going to piggyback off of Gaither. So I became an HMIS administrator in 2020, last year. I heard you all talk about this last year. I brought this to my COC last year. Our ROI went from 6 pages to 9 pages. What do I have to do? Like, no one's listening to me when I say we don't have to do this. This is a barrier. What do I have to do?
enter a TA request in the HUD Exchange portal so that Brian or Mary can come and help. TA. That's why HUD invests so heavily in technical assistance, so that you don't have to fight alone. Okay? Okay.
I always forget about the uptick of TA requests after we constantly
I
tell
know.
people to do it.
It's okay.
I look forward to working with you in the future.
It's why we do this job. Yes, Kim.
So I just wanted to confirm, because I think this would solve a lot of my problems I don't know if my community would go for it, but when you said that the client could just read the informed consent and decide to walk away, does that mean they're walking away from services too? Because that's
No,
not the
you can't
same,
refuse
right?
services
Yeah,
based
exactly.
on someone wanting to.
So they just walk away from HMIS? Okay. Okay, all right. I just wanted to clarify.
Yeah, so there's another question that we get. If someone they refuse to give me their social security number, what do I do? Do I just make one up? And no, you don't make one up. There's options in the data standards for when clients refuse to give information.
Yep.
Client refused, data not collected. There's options or client doesn't know, whatever that is. And yes, when you run an APR, it's going to show up that that data element did not have 100% collection because that was the client's choice.
Yeah.
And that's not in this stock answer, it's a different stock answer, that there's a note section.
And it's in the anonymous one too.
Yes.
Yeah. So
So
there's,
Go ahead.
No, I mean, it's just client refused. The client refused to provide their name. That doesn't mean they walk away from services. It doesn't mean you can't serve them. But there's data elements that get answered client refused. Kim, sound good? Serve everyone. Serve people. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, sorry. I was being flip about that sentence and I shouldn't have been. Serve clients. Use the data elements appropriately. Enter the data that they give you. Really, essentially, this is you don't need written permission to do it, but we're still informing clients what's going on and letting them know.
And you don't want HMIS entry to be the reason that someone doesn't come in and seek housing,
Absolutely.
right? And that's
Absolutely.
the last reason you should be turning anyone away.
And on the flip side, you don't want somebody finding out that their data was disclosed without their knowledge. So avoid that damage too. Let's not damage the clients with non-service. Let's not damage clients with disclosures that they didn't know about. Be well informed, follow your own rules.
We have one more slide next. That's our wrap-up slide.
Cool. Thanks, you guys. We
Thank you,
appreciate
everybody.
you.
Appreciate you.
Have a good day.
Welcome back to NHSDC. This is awesome.